Ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Yashwantrao Chavan Pratishthan, the president of the Pratishthan, Sri Sharad Pawar, and the members of the panel of the jury, headed by Dr. Anil Kakodkar, for giving me the Yashwantrao Chavan National Award. Mr. Chavan participated in the freedom struggle, going to prison for hoisting the national flag at Satara. He held every important political office in post-independence India, being in turn Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Defense Minister, Finance Minister, Foreign Minister, Home Minister, and Deputy Prime Minister. He even chaired the Finance Commission. He was truly a stalwart of modern India. I'm glad the Pratishthan celebrates his birth anniversary every year on this day, and truly honored to receive an award in his name. Given the importance of democracy in Mr. Chavan's life, I thought I'd speak on its role in modern capitalism for the next few minutes. It is the subject of my new book, Third Pillar. What we usually think of when we think of capitalism is really free and competitive markets. Sometimes, typically not in a place like Chicago, but elsewhere, we believe this need for a second pillar, which is governance, to enforce contracts and property rights in the markets and ensure the markets are well regulated. Now, this view of both markets and government neglects what I believe is very important, that is the third pillar, the community pillar, which represents both people living with each other in communities, but also acting with each other through democracy to make capitalism work for the many. And when capitalism works for the many, many support capitalism. And that's why we've had flourishing market democracies in the West, and that's also why a number of countries like India are turning on that path. Now, let me be a little more specific about what has been going wrong, because after all, this idyllic picture of market democracies has changed in the last few years. Technological change has been very disruptive, both in terms of creating job losses due to automation, but also increasing the ability to trade and manufacture anywhere else in the world, and that has affected some communities very adversely across the world. In these communities, which are in many ways losing economic activity and sometimes breaking down because of social factors like alcoholism, increasing use of drugs, teenage pregnancies, family breakdown, and so on, there is a search for alternatives. And sometimes politicians provide those alternatives, and what we see increasingly is across a number of countries, capitalism is under attack from populists of the left, populists of the right. We've got anti-rich movements, anti-trade movements, anti-immigration movements. My sense is that the solution to dealing with some of these problems requires addressing the problems of the community directly, the communities that have fallen behind, and trying to find ways of reviving them so that they adapt better to technological change. And let me be more detailed about this point. Many people believe the community has really very little role to play. Much less so in a developing country like India, much more so in an industrial country like the United States. Very few people remember or even have a sense when living in these big cities of what a community is and how it holds together. Nevertheless, people strive to create community. In India, many people sort of live in apartment buildings where children run between houses. At dinner time, you look for your kids, you don't know where your kids are, and sometimes you have other people's kids in your home that you give dinner to, simply because the community is well integrated and everybody trusts everybody to look after all the children of the community. In many cosmopolitan cities today, both in India but also in the United States, this kind of community has broken down. But nevertheless, there are attempts to recreate it. For example, in our Hyde Park community, many kids go to the lab school here. And a big source of social engagement for parents is really interacting with parents of their friends, their kids' friends. That's the way we get social interaction, but there are also a variety of organizations that are set up by which we get social interaction. So even though there seems to be a sense that in this day of virtual communities and so on, we don't need real communities, people strive very hard to recreate real communities. Interestingly, there's an example which I talk about in the book where a developer in Toronto, essentially halfway through the development, after connecting half the houses in the community through the internet, ran out of money, so he could not connect the other half. And the sociologists thought, this is a wonderful experiment. Let me see whether these new electronic tools of staying together, whether they substitute for real community life or they complement them. So are the people in this half of the community that was connected through the internet, do they hold together more? Do they have better friendships than the other half, or vice versa? Now, when many people talk about technology, they talk about the fears that technology will make us all sit inside our room and play video games and not talk to each other. And to that extent, he would have predicted that the people who weren't connected made stronger relationships. But turns out he was wrong. That the people who were connected through the internet found that they had stronger relationships with each other, they could recognize each other more, they had more parties together, they sent out search parties for children or dogs that were missing. They essentially had a stronger community life because both the electronic medium of connection as well as the physical medium of connection complemented each other. Now, that's heartening because in many ways, I think when you look around, one of the biggest concerns is technology will crowd out community. But in fact, technology also creates the possibility of holding community together as an alternative way of holding community together and creates also new relationships also. For example, it's easier to engage. Flash mobs are a new creation, right? It's easier to come together. This is light engagement in some sense. Technology allows for that. But when added on to deep engagement, which is the community of the physical community, I think it creates a very important social structure. But community is not just about social relationships. It's also about preparing kids for the market world that we live in. It's also about filling in holes. For example, in Southern Europe, when we had the global financial crisis, a lot of people lost jobs. Where did they go? Well, they didn't have a safety net to rely on beyond a certain point, so they went back to their village. Much like in India, when we had the textile strike in Mumbai, many people who didn't have jobs anymore, many workers, went back to their village where they were looked after while they had lost their jobs. So in that sense, the community provides both pre-market support, allows kids to be trained up for the market, and provides post-market support, that is, provides a safety net. So in these ways, the community is still relevant. What I want to talk about is how the community has been hit by markets over the last so many years, and why we essentially need to figure out how to revive the community in this new world. Take first the ICT, the information and communication technology's effect on markets. What it has done is certainly facilitated trade, and this has helped certain areas which produce, for example, steel in the United States very hard because the biggest employer has closed down because there are alternative sources of manufacturing across the world. But more insidious than this, more insidious than the fact that technology automates jobs and has probably resulted in about 4 times as many job losses as trade, is the fact that technology also creates much higher returns to education, and this has in some ways affected the community, the way I'll talk about in a second. What what technology has done is made it possible to access a much larger market. So our consultants today go across the world when they do their business. Our superstars, our divas who sing, access a market which is in the billions. Just as an example, Elizabeth Billington, who in 1801 was a star of the London Opera, she was the most famous singer in her time, but we didn't have recorded music. We didn't have transmission over the internet or transmission over radio at that time. So all she could sing to were the 1,000 or so people in the London Opera House. In one season, in 1801, she was the highest paid opera singer. She made something like £1 million in today's money. Today, Taylor Swift, who is our equivalent of Elizabeth Billington, she accesses a market of billions, and she made $170 million, about 150 million pounds at the exchange rate in 2016. So what that means is that today's opera singer effectively earns 150 times the opera singer of the past because she accesses a much bigger market than they used to in the past. And this is true of every profession. The best lawyers earn much more. The best consultants earn much more. The best investment bankers earn much more because they access a global market. But what this means is the returns to being the best have gone up. And as the returns to being the best have gone up, there's more and more incentive for parents to send their kids to better and better schools. And we'll come to the consequences in just a moment. So one effect of technology is essentially increasing the returns to education, but also globalizing markets. As a consequence, as markets have gotten more global, as they've first they went from community to nation to global, as they become bigger, governance has also moved up. So initially, the community was enough to govern trade because all the trade took place within the community. As trade took place between communities, you had more a regional government or a national government which looked after governing that trade. As it has become more international, now you need an international government. Give you one example. Take bank capital requirements. Used to be bank capital requirements were set at the town level because that's where the bank functioned. It was enough to set it at the town. Then, banks went across the state. So you had state-level capital requirements. Then banks went across the country. So you had national capital requirements. Then banks went international. Now bank capital requirements are set in Basel. The broader point is that as markets expand and become more international, governance also tends to become first more national and then international. Many more rules are set at the international level. For example, in the European Union, many of the rules are set in Brussels, not at the country capitals. And this elevation of governance as markets expand is also, in a sense, a consequence of technology because the markets have expanded as a result of technological change. So markets have expanded, government has expanded. The third pillar, the community, has actually shrunk. Why has the community shrunk? Because both the markets as well as the government have taken up some of the activities the community actually does, but also has hollowed out the community. And let me make this last point and then come to some of the consequences. Think about the traditional mixed community. If you were in the traditional mixed community, you benefited from people who were doing better than you. You benefited, the people who were doing worse than you benefited from you. And this matters because typically when you go to a class, when your kids go to a class, they go to a class where there are other kids around them. The quality of their learning depends on the average quality of other children in class. The better they are, the more your kids will learn. If there are strong returns to education, there's a strong force impelling you to move your kid from a class which has not so rich kids with them, not so well prepared kids, to a class which is much better prepared, has much better prepared children in there. what does this mean for the nature of communities? It means that as the returns to education increase, as we want our kids to do really well, we look for the best schools they could go to. And the best schools they could go to are often schools in communities with people like us, people who are better educated, who can prepare the kids better at an early stage, who can essentially give their children the best advantage they can. And so what we get when you look at this in terms of how people move is they move up to the richest community that they can afford. They move away from the old community because the old community doesn't have the kind of schooling that they really want. And what you get is a segregation. A segregation because the successful want to be with people who are also successful because that ensures the best life chances for their kids, while the not so successful are left behind because they can't follow these people into their new communities. You can see this across the United States. The number of communities which have middle-income people has fallen, while the number of communities with people at the extremes has actually increased for the last so many years. The mixed community is breaking down. Why? Because of the cessation of the successful. The successful are leaving and going into communities of their own. You can see it within cities, you can see it across cities, across suburbs, and so on. And what the cessation of the successful does is it creates really good schools in one place where the kids come in well prepared because their parents are professionals, they've taught these kids from an early age. Even their vocabulary at home gets imbibed by the kids. The kids have many more words when they come to school, while in other parts you have kids who are not so well prepared, not so well motivated, who essentially have much less, who actually hope and will get less from the world. And what this implies is, on the one hand, technology is creating a meritocracy because it's rewarding the really capable, but because many people don't have a chance to get on that ladder of meritocracy, it's making that meritocracy a hereditary meritocracy. The successful essentially can put their kids on that path to success, while the rest have a much harder time. Now, given this, it is obvious then why we have a sense of powerlessness amongst many people, even in rich, developed countries, why in France we have the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests from outside the big cities like Paris, complaining that they really are being left out of economic growth. We have such pockets in the United States, in the Midwest, where essentially the old manufacturing has died. Nothing has come to replace it. And even though San Francisco is thriving, New York is thriving, there are these areas which have been left out of economic growth. And of course, these are the areas that essentially have been lashing out against the elite, that have essentially been the supporters of the populist movements, whether they're populist movements of the left or populist movements of the right. I've taken enough time. Let me end by saying we need to find solutions. Certainly, much of the book I wrote is about how we find those solutions. Solutions in which we do need an integrated world. The populations in the West are aging. Ultimately, for the production there, they will have to find markets in the rest of the world, the younger part of the world, the emerging world, the Indias, the Africas, the Middle East, for their products. But for that, the world has to remain open. It is not a solution to erect barriers today, because those barriers will still be up when the West needs to export to the rest of the world. Similarly, the West is aging. It has to find a controlled way of absorbing immigrants. Otherwise, the question eventually will come, who's going to do the work? Who's going to support aging populations? Because increasingly the number of aged dependent on workers is increasing and will increase significantly over time. So countries need to think about how they remain open, and they need to do that in the context of technological change. It's not an easy problem to resolve, but it does have to be resolved if we are to move forward. Let me stop there. Thank you very much, and thanks again for the award. Okay, sorry.